What is mass formation psychosis?
Mr. Reagan.
Mass formation psychosis. It's something that lots of folks have been researching online, but it's also something that Google has censored and tweaked algorithms to try to discredit. So what is this phenomenon? Is it real? And why is the left so concerned about it? I'll get into all of this in one moment. First, I have to sell you something. It's a new year and not much has changed. Houses are still selling in like a week. Interest rates are at zero. Our government is still borrowing money. Printing money, 5 trillion to be exact. What could possibly go wrong? Meanwhile, consumer confidence has hit a 10-year low. Inflation's hit 6.8%, with parts of the U.S. seeing rates as high as 8%. Something is not adding up. So what can you do? Well, you can play it safe. Put some of your assets in precious metals. This will keep your money away from the volatility of the markets. It'll keep it away from inflation, and it will let you sleep at night. Now this month, Noble Gold is giving away a free 1/10 ounce solid gold American Eagle coin with any qualifying plan that you start. So talk to an expert at Noble Gold and they'll run you through your options for keeping your money safe. There's no pressure, there's no hassle, there's no call centers. You just get a chance to speak with somebody who knows what they're talking about for once. How refreshing is that? Call Noble Gold at 877-646-5347 or visit their website at noblegoldinvestments.com. That's noblegoldinvestments.com. Basically, mass formation psychosis is a new name for mass delusion, specifically the mass delusion of the left that we've been describing for years now, but with one caveat. Mass formation psychosis is intentional. It's a form of brainwashing. So basically the idea is that, yes, leftists are deluded into believing that Trump is a fascist, racist monster, and Republicans are either dumb or evil, and that vaccines are a perfect miracle cure, and they need to be mandated, and that kids should all be wearing masks all the time at school, and that's good for them, and that men are really women if they truly believe it, and that being fat is totally healthy, etc., etc., etc. But not only are these all very real delusions, but some of them aren't just the natural delusions of the left, but rather they've been intentionally programmed into the brains of leftist voters by sinister folks in power who need the public to believe certain things in order to accomplish their evil goals. And I think this is true. Not only do I think it's true, I think it's absurd not to think it's true. Of course, it's not true of every leftist delusion, but certainly some powerful folks have a strong incentive to convince the public of some things. For instance, COVID treatments. There are several ways to treat COVID that the federal government seems to have mostly ignored or even condemned. The vaccines were hailed as the great savior, and now the Pfizer COVID treatment pill, Paxlovid, is being pushed as the first effective way to treat COVID. But this is absurd. Lots of doctors have successfully used various treatment protocols around the world for the past 2 years to fight COVID. You'd think that American politicians who claim to want to fight the pandemic would be recommending these treatments, but instead they call anyone who prefers treatment to vaccination a conspiracy theorist. At the same time, the pharmaceutical companies have gotten mind-bogglingly rich. Forbes published an article last April that listed 40 new billionaires that got rich off COVID. That was last April, almost a year ago. How many of these guys got into the 3 Comma Club in 2001? And putting these two phenomena together, many have speculated that politicians are in bed with the pharmaceutical companies. Dismissing cheap, effective treatment for expensive experimental treatment options, well, that will get everyone involved rich. But how do you convince the public to support this kind of corruption? Well, you demonize the cheap, effective alternatives. They call those who advocate it conspiracy theorists. Call it propaganda, call it gaslighting, call it brainwashing. It's all the same thing. But the success that these efforts result in have been described now as mass formation psychosis. That's the term. And to be honest, I think it's nice to have a name for this phenomenon. The theory was brought to the attention of the public by Peter McCullough and Dr. Robert Malone on the Joe Rogan Experience. I was going to post clips from both of those shows on here, but then I discovered that YouTube has been removing them for spreading, quote, misinformation. And so I'd rather not step into that obvious trap because I just got banned for a week for saying that I thought the 2020 election might not have been the most honest election in history. And so if I post another video that gets irrationally censored, well, then I am banned for an entire month. But honestly, I am really rather sick of this minefield of censorship. The main problem for the public is, with this censorship, is that information that may be true is being banned. This is the modern equivalent of book burning. But the problem for those of us posting this stuff here is that they're banning stuff that we genuinely think is true. And the really frustrating thing is that the justification that they're using for this censorship, I think, is that those of us posting this stuff that YouTube believes is, quote, misinformation, that we're doing so with malicious intent. The idea is that apparently we know that what we're posting is wrong and we've posted it anyway in order to manipulate the public or something like that. But both of these assumptions are wrong. One, the stuff that I post is not misinformation. And two, I'm not posting it in order to mislead or manipulate the public. I only post stuff that I believe is true. And I'm sure that Dr. Malone and Dr. McCullough both genuinely believe that what they were saying is true as well. And Dr. Malone was also kicked off Twitter. And what makes this particularly bizarre is that Dr. Malone's research was instrumental in the development of the mRNA vaccines.
9 issued patents, all filed in 1989, all covering this technology, including the initial reduction to practice, all with my name on them. I would call that the original inventor, and I wrote the initial disclosures, Alex.
This guy clearly has a valuable perspective worth hearing. But Twitter has determined that he's committed thought crimes, and he must be banished. But what these guys said is what we've been talking about for years now. The left is irrational. Democrat voters follow every government mandate and recommendation blindly. But these guys think that this is not just an incidental bifurcation of the gullible and the skeptical, but rather a carefully planned and precisely implemented brainwashing of the populace. The great irony here is that despite the left banning these guys and calling this a crazy conspiracy theory, the left accuses us of precisely the same thing. Leftists claim that Trump has induced some kind of mass psychosis. They consider Trump supporters cultists.
Donald Trump has turned a large swath of white evangelical Christianity into a cult.
Trump's supporters are a cult.
I mean, it is like a cult when you go to those rallies.
They're just living in, it's almost cult-like for some of the people out there in the public.
The word cult has been popping up more and more. Anthony Scaramucci talked about his claim that Trump supporters are in a cult. Dan Rather said he thinks support for Trump seems increasingly cultish. John Weaver said the GOP is not a party anymore in the traditional sense. It's a cult.
A dangerous religious cult. All the signs are there.
I'm not saying this is a cult, but it is cult-like.
The question is, how are we going to really almost deprogram these people who have signed up for the cult of Trump?
They signed up to become foot soldiers in a cult of personality.
They don't just follow him. They don't just agree with him. They almost worship him.
Now, I don't think these people are right. I think that they're crazy. But they have the right to speculate about conservatives being brainwashed. I mean, if you're living in precisely the same world as somebody else and you're seeing precisely the same things, but you're perceiving everything completely differently, well, then one of you is probably perceiving things accurately and the other is probably deluded. And so it's important that we challenge our assumptions and figure out what's true and what isn't. It's important that we speculate about things like cultism and mass formation psychosis. And no one on the right is calling for the censorship of all the deranged leftists who claim that Trump supporters are all cultists. But the left does call for censorship of anyone proposing that the left is suffering from mass formation psychosis. That says a lot, I think, about who's willing to challenge their biases and who's hiding from reality. Head in the sand. Another irony is that the left believes that Trump cultists just believe whatever Trump tells them, and yet Trump supporters are also vilified for being hesitant to take the vaccines. But Trump's been encouraging people to take the vaccines. Any vaccine hesitancy among conservatives certainly is not directed by Trump. It's actually the exact opposite. It's Trump supporters thinking for themselves, getting alternative opinions, alternative sources of information, and allowing themselves to be skeptical. Not just of Biden and Fauci and the CDC and the WHO, but of Donald Trump. Leftists are funny. They're so brainwashed that they look at folks who think for themselves and they say, those people are totally brainwashed. So does the left suffer from mass formation psychosis? Yes, they definitely do. Now look, mass hysteria, mass delusion, mass psychosis, these are all known phenomena that have been recorded throughout history. On June 24th, 1374, thousands of people in Aachen, Germany began dancing. They were dancing inexplicably in the streets. This is a phenomenon known as the dance plague. In 1518, this happened again in Strasbourg, Germany. In fact, the dance plague phenomenon has been documented throughout history, and during these bouts of mass hysteria, participants danced themselves literally to death. They danced until they died.
They didn't stop to eat, drink, or sleep. Their feet were soon bloody and torn, and their faces were warped by fear and pain. And then, the dying started.
Dancers were in obvious pain, screaming in agony and begging for mercy from whatever bizarre affliction they were suffering from. As the summer stretched on and the temperatures rose, as many as 15 people a day were dying from dancing in the streets.
The people would continue vigorously jumping and dancing about, sometimes also screaming out or chanting, until completely exhausted, at which point they would collapse and some of them would die from cardiac arrest or injuries suffered from their violent dance.
The earliest known dancing plague hit Central Europe in the 7th century, and outbreaks continued to appear for the next 1,000 years or so. Incidents were reported in England, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, and the largest was said to affect more than 1,000 people at one time.
Rasmussen polled Americans about their willingness to punish the unvaccinated. The results were alarming. Most Americans were naturally against punishing the unvaccinated, but many Democrat voters supported even the harshest proposed measures. So according to the Rasmussen poll, 55% of Democrat voters supported the idea of fining those who refused vaccination. 59% favored full-time home confinement for all unvaccinated Americans. 48% think that the government should have the right to imprison anyone who publicly questions the efficacy of COVID vaccines on the TV, on the radio, or on social media. That one's just nuts. That is nuts. 45% of Democrats favor sending unvaccinated Americans to internment camps, which were labeled in the poll as designated facilities. 47% support digital tracking of all unvaccinated Americans, and perhaps most horrific of all, 29% of Democrats support temporarily taking children away from unvaccinated parents. Now, a lot of people have likened the willingness of Democrats to go along with the authoritarian dictates that we've seen implemented since the start of the pandemic with the authoritarianism of 1930s Germany. And having read through these poll questions, you can see why. For Americans to believe that the children of those they disagree with on political issues must be taken away, a belief that they formed because of the information fed to them by politicians CNN and MSNBC, these people are either evil at their very core, or they're completely brainwashed, or both. Now, I don't care what you call it. Brainwashing, mass hypnosis, mass delusion, mass hysteria, propaganda, Trump derangement syndrome, groupthink, group lunacy, whatever. The left no longer lives in the real world. They live in a fantasy world of their own making. In this fantasy world, kids in drag are celebrated. Christianity is condemned. Men are women, and obesity is healthy. And again, I don't care what you call this phenomenon, but I think mass formation psychosis has a pretty good ring to it. Well, that's it for me, and remember, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant, it's just that they're all crazy. Good night.
Someone very profoundly once said, many years ago, that if fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism. And what is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't this the liberal philosophy? The conservative, so-called, is the one that says, less government, get off my back, get out of my pocket, and let me have more control of my own destiny.